Hey guys, tonight we wander out onto the southern coast of England, where the cliffs loom like ragged teeth against the restless sea. The air smells of salt and damp stone, and the gulls are already circling above, sounding as if they're laughing at you for even trying to stay upright in this wind. You're in Lyme Regis, a place so pretty on a postcard, yet so treacherous underfoot, with landslides ready to swallow you whole, and waves waiting to drag you under. And honestly, if you go fossil hunting here at night, you probably won't survive this. But lucky for you, we're staying tucked in bed while someone else takes all the risks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop a comment with your location and a local time where you're re-watching from. I always love seeing just how far this cozy little channel has traveled. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cliffs of Lyme Regis don't just sit quietly in the background, they seem alive. Every wave gnaws at the base of the rock. Every storm peels back another layer of time. You can imagine the ground shifting under your boots, the soft crunch of shale giving way, and the sense that the entire coastline is waiting to reveal something it has hidden for millions of years. It's a place where the past doesn't feel buried, it feels restless, as though eager to be found. Back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when Mary Anning was a little girl here, the cliffs were both playground and danger zone. Families like hers lived in small, cramped cottages, their lives tied to the rhythms of the sea. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbour, and storms often meant both disaster and discovery. After all, a heavy rainfall could loosen slabs of rock, exposing the bones of creatures no one had ever seen before. Picture yourself standing there, cliffs layered in grey and brown, the occasional gleam of ammonites curling like stone spirals, and the sound of your own breath competing with the crash of waves. Fossils were everywhere, if only you knew how to spot them. For Mary, that knack became second nature. She could walk along the beach and see in an ordinary chunk of rock what others dismissed as rubble. The irony is, most people at the time thought of fossils as just curiosities. They were trinkets, souvenirs for tourists, little novelties to place on a mantelpiece. Some even believed they were just nature's decorative accidents, sports of nature, as they were called. It sounds almost funny now, considering one of Mary's finds would end up rewriting the story of life itself. Historians still argue whether it was her persistence or pure chance that led her to be in the right place at the right time. But it wasn't just science whispering from those cliffs. There were older whispers, two local myths, and seaside superstitions. Some people believed that the spiral ammonites were snake stones, coiled serpents turned to rock by the hand of St. Hilda. You'd see locals carve little snake heads onto the fossils, selling them to visitors who wanted a piece of holy magic. Imagine that. holding a prehistoric mollusk in your hand and convincing yourself it used to slither through Eden. And if you've ever bought sunscreen, here's a quirky tidbit. Locals used to grind up bees or stones, or even powdered crocodile dung as relias, cures, and lotions. Picture rubbing that into your skin while standing under a blazing sun, convinced it would protect you. Compared to that, modern SPF feels like a gift straight from heaven. Mary's world was shaped by this strange mix of faith, folklore, and raw natural power. The sea gave, and the sea took away, and the cliffs were the stage for both wonder and danger. On one hand, there was the childlike thrill of finding something shiny among the pebbles. On the other, the constant fear of falling rocks, sudden storms, and waves that didn't care if you could swim. You, standing there in her shoes, would feel the same tug-of-thrill that pulls you closer to the edge, even as you know it could all collapse. So here you are, with the salt on your lips, eyes scanning the stony ground, heart quickening each time you spot a spiral or a rib pressed into stone. You don't fully know it yet, but this is the same path Mary will walk her whole life. She search, she scrape, she climb where others fear to go. And one day, people will say she found monsters in the cliffs, though she never called them monsters herself. For her, they were simply the truth, lying in wait. Mary's childhood unfolded in the narrow streets and weathered cottages of Lyme Regis, a seaside town that seemed to teeter between hardship and enchantment. You picture yourself following her small footsteps across the uneven cobblestones, the salty breeze catching at your clothes, the cries of gulls swooping overhead like hecklers at a play. For most children, the shore was a place to chase crabs, splash in shallow pools, or pick pretty shells. For Mary, it was the beginning of a lifelong apprenticeship in reading the secrets written in stone. Her father, Richard Anning, was a cabinet maker by trade, though trade in that era often meant a patchwork of odd jobs stitched together just to keep bread on the table. Cabinet orders were rare in Lyme Regis, and the sea was no easy provider. So Richard took his children Mary and her older brother Joseph down to the cliffs to hunt for curiosities. These were the fossils locals dug out and sold to tourists who passed through town. Hoping to return home with a pocketful of seaside magic, imagine trudging along the beach in their company Richard with a sturdy walking stick and a small hammer. Joseph scrambling ahead with the reckless energy of a boy, and little Mary just a girl in patched clothes, her sharp eyes already keener than either of theirs. Her father taught her to look closely at the way a stone cracked open, at the telltale spiral on a lump of shale, at the faint outline of ribs pressed into the rock like a shadow frozen in time. Each discovery was carefully wrapped and carried home, sometimes polished or trimmed, then placed in the Anning family shop window. Their cottage doubled as a fossil shop, though shop might be too generous a word. Picture a cramped room smelling faintly of damp wood and salt air, with shelves lined with ammonites, belemnites, and odd little fragments no one could quite name. To visitors, they were conversation pieces. To the Anning family, they were survival. Mary's knack for spotting fossils was already uncanny. While most children might run past a pebble-strewn slope, she would crouch down, tilt her head, and notice the faintest ripple in stone that betrayed a hidden shell. Some locals even said she had the eye. Whether that was meant as admiration or suspicion depended on who was speaking. Remember, this was an age when superstition ran alongside religion, and a girl who seemed too lucky at finding ancient relics might raise eyebrows. But Mary's life wasn't just curiosity and seaside scavenging. It was also marked by hardship. Money was scarce. Her parents struggled with debt. Hunger was a steady visitor in the household, and each fossil sold might mean the difference between meat in the stew or another thin broth. And then there was the storm that changed everything. Mary was just 15 months old when she was caught in a lightning strike. Her nurse had taken her, along with 2 other children, to watch a traveling horse show. Out of nowhere, a thunderstorm erupted, and a bolt of lightning struck the group. The 2 other children died instantly. Mary, against all odds, survived. Imagine the whispers that must have passed through the town afterward, how the little girl had been spared while others perished. In an age steeped in religious interpretation, her survival wasn't chalked up to luck. It was destiny. Some said she had been touched by God, marked out for something remarkable. Others muttered in less charitable tones, perhaps thinking such a survivor would never quite belong. For Mary herself, too young to remember. It was a story she would carry in the shadow of her life, a strange prologue that made her seem destined for unusual paths. And maybe it shaped the way she moved along those dangerous cliffs later in life. Perhaps each step she took among falling rocks carried an unconscious conviction. If she had survived lightning, she could survive this. Of course, not every moment of her childhood was painted in myth. Picture her at 10 years old, her clothes patched and shoes worn thin, carrying a little basket and scanning the shore. The cliffs above her look as though they might crumble at any moment, layers upon layers stacked like a giant's library of stone. With her small hammer, she taps at a rock, patient, careful, learning how stone behaves. She doesn't know the word paleontology. No one in Lyme Regis does. But she knows that the rocks speak if you're willing to listen. By the turn of the 19th century, fossil hunting was a curious mix of hobby, trade, and spectacle. Wealthy tourists visiting the seaside would often bring home ammonites, calling them snake stones, and weaving them into stories for their parlor guests. Scholars, meanwhile, argued in Latin about whether such objects were remnants of Noah's flood or playful tricks of the earth. Historians still argue whether these debates helped or hindered Mary's path, whether the confusion of her era created more space for discovery or left her fighting uphill against disbelief. Here's a quirky detail you might enjoy. At the time, people believed certain fossils could cure ailments. Powdered ammonite was sometimes sold as a treatment for snake bites. Imagine grinding up an ancient sea creature just to sprinkle it in water and hope it worked. Today, it sounds absurd, but in Mary's childhood, that was part of the lore swirling around every stone. For Mary, none of this was abstract. She wasn't studying fossils in books or behind glass cases in London. She was clambering up slopes, scraping mud from her skirts, wiping grit from her eyes, and learning with her hands. Each fossil she found helped pay the rent. Each fossil she missed meant another week of hunger. And you, standing beside her in imagination, might feel that pressure toother, cold wind gnawing at your bones, the dull ache of hunger in your belly, the quiet hope that this rock, just this one, might contain something remarkable, something that someone will buy, something that will mean the difference between bare cupboards and a meal. Mary's childhood wasn't gilded with privilege. It was rough-edged, uncertain, and often lonely. But out of that hardship, something rare was taking shape: a resilience, a sharpness of mind, and an intimacy with the earth that no classroom could provide. She wasn't yet the Mary Anning who would rewrite natural history, but the contours of that destiny were forming, one small fossil at a time. Mary was not yet old enough to properly remember the day the lightning bolt came down, but the story became woven into her very identity, repeated by townsfolk until it grew into something almost mythological. You can imagine the hushed tones neighbors leaning over fences, saying how the Anning girl had survived what no one should survive. It was a mark of destiny, they insisted, a sign she was meant for something extraordinary. Picture the scene. A traveling horse show had rolled into town, a rare source of excitement in a place where entertainment usually meant hymns, gossip, and the occasional market fair. A nursemaid, caring for baby Mary and 2 other children, carried them into the crowd. The air was charged, the sky heavy with that strange silence that often comes before a storm. Then sudden thunder, a blinding crack of light, and the world seemed to split open. 2 children fell still at once. Mary, barely more than a year old, was struck as well but lived. When she grew older, the tale followed her like a shadow. Some believed she had been touched by divine will, preserved for a purpose. Others muttered uneasily, as if survival itself made her uncanny. In truth, Mary herself never claimed to feel special because of it, though you can imagine how the knowledge might shape the way she walked through life. To survive lightning as a child and to later spend decades scrambling up unstable cliffs, it gave her a fearlessness that most could not muster. Life in Lyme Regis carried on. Small-town rhythms don't stop for miracles. The Anning household remained a place of constant hustle. Richard Anning's fragile health meant he often struggled to keep steady work. The family depended on whatever money could be scraped together from fossil sales and carpentry. Mary's mother, Molly, was practical and stern, keeping the children in line while stretching every coin. Hunger was a frequent guest at the table, and yet, despite the poverty, curiosity blossomed. Mary and her brother Joseph were often seen trailing after their father, baskets in hand, scouring the beach. Some days yielded little more than shells and broken belemnites, long bullet-shaped fossils that tourists nicknamed devil's fingers. Other days, if fortune was kind, they might find a whole ammonite, its spiral pattern intact, gleaming faintly after a storm had peeled back the cliff. Think of Mary crouching in the sand, her small hands brushing grit away, her breath catching as she revealed a perfect coil. A stranger might have walked past without noticing. But Mary had that uncanny focus, the ability to see what was hidden in plain sight. The locals were used to children collecting curiosities, but there was something different about the Anning girl. She remembered every detail of the rocks she studied. If you asked her later where she had seen a particular stone, she could lead you back to the very spot. If a fossil was half exposed, she would recall its placement and return after the next storm, when the tide had done more of the work. It was patience disguised as play. At the same time, her survival of the lightning strike gave her a strange kind of resilience. Imagine her walking along the dangerous cliffs, stones tumbling underfoot, and telling herself, "If lightning could not kill me, this won't either." That sort of quiet, stubborn confidence is what carried her later when cliffs really did collapse, when danger was not theoretical but a constant companion. Meanwhile, the world beyond Lyme Regis was beginning to wrestle with bigger questions about these so-called curiosities. Scholars in London debated whether fossils were mere sports of nature, meaning whimsical stone patterns formed for decoration, or actual remains of long-dead creatures. Historians still argue whether those early debates were motivated more by science or by theology, because extinction was a troubling concept in an age when the Bible was read literally. If God's creation was perfect, how could any of his creatures simply vanish? Mary, of course, wasn't sitting in a lecture hall. She was crouched on the beach, but the stones she carried home were quietly feeding those very debates. Each ammonite she sold, each fossil she wrapped in newspaper, traveled farther than she ever could, ending up in the hands of collectors and scholars who tried to fit them into their understanding of the world. Here's a quirky tidbit that might make you raise an eyebrow. Some people in that era believed fossilized sea creatures were the remains of animals drowned in Noah's flood. A whole biblical backstory was assigned to the spiral ammonites and long-beaked bella. If you picked one up on the beach and showed it to a devout neighbor, they might nod gravely and say, "Proof of the flood, right there in your hand." But Mary wasn't nodding along with superstition. Even as a child, her eyes were sharper, her instincts more grounded. She saw patterns where others saw mystery, and she began to trust the evidence her hands could hold. Every time she cracked open a stone and revealed something once alive, she wasn't just collecting, she was listening to the earth itself. So, as you follow her through those early years, the rhythm becomes clear. Storms rolled in, cliffs crumbled, Mary searched, She was a survivor twice over, once from lightning, and again from poverty. Both survivals pushed her closer to the destiny that awaited. She didn't yet know that she would one day pull entire skeletons out of the cliffs. Skeletons that would shake the scientific world. For now, she was just a girl with sharp eyes, a basket, and a stubborn will. Walking the dangerous line where land meets sea, where past meets present. The cliffs were Mary's classroom, but her lessons were often written in hardship. By the time she was 11, she already understood loss in a way that most children are spared. Her father, Richard Anning, had been her guide into the world of fossils. He was the one who taught her to wield a hammer, to listen for the difference in sound when tapping stone, to see the faint shadow of a spiral where others saw only rubble. Yet his health had always been fragile. Years of carpentry bent his back and strained his lungs, and the damp Lyme Regis air did him no favors. Imagine a cold winter morning in the early 1810s. The cottage draughty, the fire burning low, the sea groaning just beyond the town. Richard is coughing again, each breath sounding like it scrapes against his chest. For Mary and Joseph, this wasn't just the sound of sickness, it was the sound of dread. They knew what it meant. By 1810, Richard had passed away, leaving behind not security but debt. His cabinet making never brought in steady money, and fossil sales barely patched the gaps. With him gone, the family faced a wall of unpaid bills. They were poor before, but now they were desperate. Mary's mother, Molly, shouldered what she could. She kept the small fossil stall going, selling to passing tourists, bargaining with whoever came through town. But the truth was plain. Without Richard, the family needed Mary and Joseph to become more than children. They had to hunt fossils, not just for curiosity, but for survival. Picture yourself walking beside Mary on those cliffs after her father's death. The wind is harsher, the stones seem heavier, and every discovery carries more weight. It's no longer about the thrill of finding something unusual, it's about whether that ammonite will sell for enough to buy bread. You can almost feel her determination in the way she bends over a stone, fingers numb from cold, refusing to give up until she's pried it free. This was the crucible where Mary's resilience was forged. While most girls her age might have been expected to learn needlework or prepare for domestic duties, Mary was scaling cliffs and digging into shale with a hammer. Poverty didn't allow her the luxury of conformity. At the same time, the wider world was beginning to show cracks in its understanding of fossils. Wealthy visitors from London came to Lyme Regis not just for the sea air, but for the fossil trade, which was gaining momentum. Collectors wanted curiosities for their cabinets, and scholars, though still divided, were starting to see these relics as more than just decorations. Historians still argue whether this surge of interest helped or hindered Mary's path. On one hand, there was a market for her finds. On the other, she was a poor, working-class girl in a field dominated by men with titles and university credentials. And here is a quirky detail that seems almost absurd now. Some people at the time thought fossils grew inside rocks like crystals, forming naturally rather than being remnants of once living creatures. Imagine cracking open a stone to reveal the ribs of an ichthyosaur, and having someone insist, "Oh yes, that just grew there like a cabbage." It est the sort of thing that makes you want to roll your eyes so hard you could sprain them. For Mary, though, the debates of scholars were distant thunder. Her concern was feeding her family. Every fossil extracted and sold was another day they could keep a roof over their heads. And every storm that rolled in was a chance to find something new, but also a reminder of danger. The cliffs could collapse without warning, boulders crashing down with lethal force. Some fossil hunters were crushed, some were swept away by waves. Mary herself narrowly avoided death more than once, though we'll get to those stories later. Still, she persevered. You can imagine her trudging home with Joseph, their baskets heavy with fossils, their faces smudged with dirt, their stomachs growling, but their spirits lifted because they knew today's finds might bring in a few shillings. The shop window at their cottage glowed with strange shapes. Spirals, spines, shells pressed into stone. To some, it was a display of oddities. To Mary and her family, it was hope made tangible. At the same time, whispers about Mary began to circulate beyond Lyme Regis. Word spread that there was a girl on the coast with an uncanny eye for fossils, a girl who could find treasures where others walked blindly past. Some dismissed her, attributing her skill to luck. Others, especially visiting collectors, began to recognize that she had a gift. She wasn't just picking up curiosities, she was uncovering creatures long forgotten. The death of her father had left the Annings with grief and poverty, but it also thrust Mary into the role she was born to play. Without him, she became not just an assistant, but the central figure in her family's survival. The cliffs that had once been a playground became a battleground, and Mary emerged, hammer in hand, ready to wrestle with stone and time itself. The cliffs of Lyme Regis are deceptive. At a distance, they look almost peaceful, layered, like a cake of stone, standing stoic against the sea. But walk closer, and you feel how alive they are. Every gust of wind, every crash of waves gnaws at them, loosening slabs, sending pebbles rattling down slopes like warning shots. For Mary Anning and her brother Joseph, these cliffs weren't just scenery. They were both adversary and treasure chest. It was during one of these family hunts, not long after their father's death, that fate brought them to a discovery so staggering it would change everything. The first complete skeleton of an ichthyosaur. Picture it, the tide low, the sand damp and cold beneath your boots. Joseph, older and restless, clambers ahead, scanning the cliff face. Mary follows, slower but sharper, her eyes tuned to the subtle language of stone. They're not looking for anything specific. How could they be? They've only ever seen shells, ammonites, maybe a tooth here and there. But then Joseph spots something protruding from the cliff. At first glance, it looks like a dark curve of bone embedded in rock. He calls Mary over. Together they scrape at the shale, careful but eager, and what they reveal is unlike anything they've seen before. The outline is long, serpentine, with ribs fanning out like the slats of an umbrella. The skull is massive, with jaws lined with sharp teeth. This isn't a snake. This isn't a fish. This is something monstrous. Something no fisherman in Lyme Regis would ever haul up in his nets. It takes months of labor to excavate the skeleton, a task made harder by the cliff's constant threat of collapse. Imagine Mary, barely a teenager, chipping away at stone, while the sea growls behind her. Her skirts are heavy with mud, her fingers numb, yet her focus is absolute. Slowly, piece by piece, they free the bones from their rocky prison. What emerges is astonishing. A creature nearly complete, longer than a man, with eyes so large they seem almost cartoonish. Word spreads quickly. Locals come to gawk. Some call it a crocodile. Others, uneasy, mutter that it's a dragon. After all, what else could such a monstrous skeleton be? Here's a quirky tidbit. A local surgeon, Henry Host Henley, bought the skeleton for his collection. He had it mounted in his house and occasionally invited curious guests to marvel at it. Imagine being served tea in a parlor with a prehistoric sea monster looming over the fireplace. Eventually, the skeleton made its way into scientific circles, sparking debates far beyond Dorset. This is where history sharpens. Mary's ichthyosaur find wasn't just remarkable, it was revolutionary. Up to that point, most fossilized bones were fragments, bits and pieces hinting at larger creatures. But this was nearly whole. It was undeniable. It forced naturalists and scholars to confront a troubling idea. Perhaps there were creatures that once roamed the earth or the seas that no longer existed. Historians still argue whether this ichthyosaur was the first complete skeleton ever found. But one thing is certain. It became a cornerstone in the emerging science of paleontology. Of course, Mary and Joseph didn't yet have the language for this. They didn't say paleontology or Mesozoic. For them, it was simpler. It was a chance to sell something valuable, to keep their family afloat. And yet, for Mary, there was more. You can feel it in the way she lingered over the bones, memorizing each curve, each joint. While others saw a commodity, she saw a puzzle story waiting to be pieced together. Imagine yourself standing beside her as she gazes at the skull. The teeth glint faintly in the light. You wonder what kind of beast this was, how it swam, what it hunted. Was it fierce? Was it elegant? Did it rule the seas like a tyrant? Or was it merely one of many strange swimmers in a vanished world? Questions you can't answer, not yet. But the thrill of wonder is already tugging at your chest. And Mary, though poor, though untrained, though ignored by the societies of men in London, feels the same thrill. She doesn't need Latin names or scientific theories to know what she has uncovered. She knows this skeleton once lived, once moved, once breathed. She knows it isn't like anything alive now, and that truth is enough to keep her searching. The ichthyosaur find changed how others saw Lyme Regis too. Collectors began to descend upon the town in greater numbers, hoping to pluck treasures from the cliffs. Some came respectfully, others came greedily. But none had the eye that Mary did. None had the patience to wait for storms, to climb into dangerous places, to see the faintest hint of bone in a slab of stone. It was the beginning of a lifetime of discovery for her. And though the ichthyosaur would travel far beyond Lyme Regis, admired in great halls and debated in learned societies, its story always circled back to a girl on the cliffs, mud on her boots, eyes sharp as flint, finding monsters in stone. You can almost hear the sound before you see it, the steady tap, tap, tap of hammer on stone, echoing against the cliffs. This was Mary's rhythm, her daily music, as she worked the unforgiving landscape of Lyme Regis, tools in hand, skirts tied to keep them from dragging in the mud. She was an artist chiseling against time itself. Her canvas wasn't canvas at all, but the shifting layers of blue lias shale, stacked like pages of a book, so ancient it made human history look like a scribble in the margins. Mary's toolkit was basic but effective. A small hammer for tapping, chisels of varying widths, a pick for prying. Some tools were hand-me-downs from her father, dulled by use but sharpened again and again. Others she improvised bits of iron, repurposed for the task. You can imagine her kneeling in the shale, gripping her hammer in hands calloused far beyond her years, each blow carefully measured so as not to shatter the fossil within. Working the cliffs wasn't just skill, it was danger incarnate. The Blue Lias cliffs were notorious for landslides. Rainwater seeped into cracks, softening the shale until entire slabs came crashing down with no warning. Fossil hunters, locals and visitors alike, sometimes paid with their lives for a moment's inattention. Mary knew this. She'd seen rocks tumble without notice, boulders shattering at her feet, and yet she kept going, day after day, as if survival itself depended on those cliffs, which, of course, it did. Imagine standing beside her. The sky is grey, gulls shriek above, and the sea roars below. Every few minutes, you hear a trickle of pebbles sliding down, a reminder that the cliffs don't care about your presence. Your heart might leap each time the ground shifts, but Mary is steady. Her eyes narrow, her hammer swings, and her body moves with the cliff's moods, as though she can read their intentions. And she could. Mary developed an almost uncanny sense of when a cliff face might give way. She could tell by the way water seeped through the shale, by the sound of a rock settling, even by the subtle shifts underfoot. It wasn't magic, though locals sometimes thought so. It was instinct honed by survival, sharpened by years of watching stone behave. Fossil hunting also demanded patience bordering on obsession. Sometimes a promising ridge would turn out to be nothing but shapeless stone. Sometimes an ammonite broke apart in her hands, wasted effort and shattered profit. Other times, though, the reward was breathtaking. A flawless ammonite spiral gleaming like a coiled galaxy, or a belemite with its pointed shaft intact, resembling the dart of some long-forgotten squid. These finds weren't just curios, they were money, bread on the table, rent paid for another week. And sometimes, if luck was truly generous, a rib bone or vertebra peeked out of the shale. That was when Mary's heart would quicken. Those pieces hinted at something larger, a skeleton hidden within the cliff like a ghost trapped in stone. For such treasures, she would work for weeks, even months, returning after storms, chiseling bit by bit until the creature revealed itself. Here's a quirky detail that might make you shake your head. In those days, fossil hunters didn't wear helmets, gloves, or protective gear. They climbed cliffs in everyday clothes, skirts or coats flapping in the wind, their only shield the reflex to duck when rocks fell. Mary often carried a small lantern for early mornings or fading afternoons, its weak glow barely enough to keep her steady on treacherous ground. Imagine balancing on slippery shale, tools in hand, knowing a single misstep could send you tumbling into the sea. And yet, this danger was part of the allure. Each time Mary returned from the cliffs with a basket of fossils, she returned triumphant, not just over hunger or poverty, but over the cliffs themselves. She had stared down their menace, outlasted their tricks, and taken from them a piece of their ancient memory. Meanwhile, back in town, the fossils sparked endless conversation. Visitors to Lyme Regis marveled at the strange shapes for sale in the awning shop window. Some said the creatures were antediluvian, survivors or victims of the Great Flood. Others insisted they were just decorative oddities. Historians still argue whether Mary herself fully grasped the implications of extinction during these years. Did she understand that she was holding proof of vanished worlds? Or did she simply follow her instinct, collecting, cleaning, and selling what the cliffs gave her? The truth may be somewhere in between. The irony was sharp. While scholars in London debated whether fossils were real creatures or sports of nature, Mary was literally pulling the answers out of the ground. Her hands knew truths their pens only guessed at, but she was never smug about it. Mary's manner was quiet, practical, almost modest. She never claimed special genius, only persistence. And perhaps that was her secret power, the patience to keep looking where others stopped, to keep chipping where others gave up, to believe that within stone lay stories worth hearing. So you walk with her in imagination, the cliffs looming above, the sea restless below. Each tap of her hammer is a heartbeat. Each fossil uncovered a whisper from the past. You feel the danger, yes, but also the strange calm that comes from trusting the earth to reveal its secrets, one fragment at a time. And that, more than anything, was Mary's gift. Not luck, not magic, but a stubborn faith in stone. The cliffs could not keep their secrets forever, and neither could the little fossil shop on Broad Street. Word spread, sometimes by whispers among curious travellers, sometimes by louder boasts from collectors who wanted to flash their new prizes at dinner parties in London. Slowly, Lyme Regis became more than just another seaside town. It became a pilgrimage spot for the curious, the wealthy, and the scholarly, though often those three groups blurred together in awkward ways. You can picture the scene. The salty smell of fish still hanging in the market stalls. Children chasing after stray dogs on the cobblestones, and then said a near-polished carriage rolling through town. Its passengers step out, fine coats brushing against muddy streets, their eyes darting as if they've stumbled into some exotic marketplace. They are here for the cliffs, and for the curiosities pulled from them. And at the centre of it all is Mary Ann. Visitors came with different motives. The wealthy tourists wanted souvenirs, ammonites, polished smooth belonites that could serve as conversation pieces. They strolled the beach in delicate boots, squinting at stones as if expecting a fossil to politely announce itself. Often they ended up buying directly from the Anning shop instead, preferring not to risk dirtying their gloves. Scientists came too, though in the early 1800s, scientist was a slippery word. They called themselves naturalists, geologists, or simply gentlemen with an interest in nature. These men often wrote in Latin, quoted the Bible liberally, and assumed their social standing gave them authority over the very rocks beneath their feet. And yet, time and again, they found themselves learning from a poor young woman with no formal education. Mary's encounters with these visitors were rarely straightforward. On one hand, they marveled at her finds and sometimes even praised her skill. On the other, many of them underestimated her, treating her as a supplier of objects rather than as a thinker in her own right. Historians still argue whether her exclusion from learned societies was due more to her gender, her class, or simply the snobbery of the age. Whatever the reason, Mary remained on the margins of the scientific world, even as her discoveries reshaped it. And yet, she wasn't without allies. Some collectors and scholars genuinely respected her. One of the most notable was Henry de la Becque, a geologist and artist who grew up in Lyme Regis. He often walked the same cliffs as Mary and knew firsthand how dangerous and skilled the work could be. Later, when Mary faced financial struggles, de la Becque even created a famous lithographed Duria Antiquia, a fanciful reconstruction of ancient marine life-selling prints to raise money for her. Imagine that, the first ever illustration of prehistoric life made possible because of Mary's fossils. But not every visitor was so generous. Some would buy from her, then publish papers describing the fossils as if they had discovered them personally. Others treated her knowledge as a curiosity, asking her to guide them along the cliffs, to explain the stones underfoot, late to dismiss her once they returned to London. You can almost hear the dismissive tone. Remarkable woman, quite sharp for her background. But of course, not a true scholar. Here, essay quirky tidbit. Some wealthy visitors were so unprepared for the cliffs that they hired locals to carry them in chairs down to the beach. Picture that, a powdered gentleman bouncing along in a chair, determined to hunt fossils while someone else literally carried him to the stones. Meanwhile, Mary trudged with her basket and hammer, skirts muddied, far more skilled and far less celebrated. Still, Mary knew the value of her reputation. She cultivated connections carefully, never boastful, but always ready to show her finds. She arranged fossils neatly in her shop, labeled them with care, and even cleaned them so that they gleamed in the light. Her specimens became must-have tokens for anyone who wanted to prove their sophistication. Owning an Anning fossil meant you had not just wealth, but a taste for the cutting edge of science. The irony, of course, is that many of the men who strutted through her shop later built their careers on the very fossils she uncovered. Some gave her credit, others conveniently forgot. But through it all, Mary kept working. She wasn't chasing fame, though fame came in flashes. She was chasing truth, hammer against stone, patient as the sea. And you, standing in her world, would feel the odd tension of those encounters. On one side, the cliffs roar, indifferent, spilling secrets after every storm. On the other, the polished visitors awed, skeptical, sometimes generous, sometimes exploitative. And in the middle, Mary, bridging two worlds. The dirt of the cliffs on her hands, the fossils gleaming in the parlours of London. It's a strange balance, isn't it? To be indispensable yet overlooked, admired yet dismissed. And yet Mary walked that line with the same stubborn grace she walked the cliffs. If the ichthyosaur had startled people, what came next downright rattled them. The cliffs of Lyme Regis were not finished giving up their ghosts, and Mary Anning was not finished coaxing them out. With each discovery, the boundary between curiosity and terror blurred. As creatures stranger than anything in fishermen's nets began to surface in stone. Imagine standing with her after a heavy storm, the shales slick and shining under a watery sun. Pebbles crunch underfoot, gulls scream overhead, and the cliffs hiss softly as trickles of mud slide down their face. Mary leans on her hammer, squinting at a darker patch of stone. She chips carefully, and suddenly another rib emerges. This one doesn't look like the ichthyosaurs. The shape is off, longer, thinner. She works for days, then weeks, returning with Joseph to loosen more stone. And slowly, what takes form is not a fish lizard, not a crocodile, but something else entirely. The body is long and slender, the neck impossibly stretched, with a small skull perched at the end, like a punctuation mark. It looks almost comical, as though some mischievous artist stretched an animal the wrong way. The first plesiosaur had entered the world. Now, let's pause here, because this was not just another fossil. This was an outright challenge to everything people thought they knew about nature. The ichthyosaur, bizarre as it was, could at least be compared to something familiar. A crocodile, a dolphin, a lizard. But The plesiosaur, nothing alive, looked remotely like it. Even today, if you were to glance at a drawing without context, you might laugh. And back then, scholars didn't just laugh, they argued. Fiercely, some accused Mary of faking the find. Historians still argue whether this reaction came from honest skepticism or from the discomfort of men, unwilling to accept a working-class woman's discovery. The naturalist Georges Cuvier, one of the giants of early paleontology, initially dismissed the plesiosaur skeleton as a fraud cobbled together from mismatched bones. Only later did he admit, somewhat begrudgingly, that it was real. Here's a quirky tidbit. While Cuvier doubted Mary's plesiosaur, he had no problem seriously studying mummified ibises from Egypt in search of evidence about the age of the earth. Picture a room full of scholars poring over bird mummies while scoffing at the woman who had literally dragged an ancient sea reptile out of a cliff. The irony could knock you over harder than the Dorset wind. The plesiosaur also ignited debates about extinction itself. If these long-necked beasts once swam the seas, where were they now? Were they hiding in some uncharted ocean? Had the biblical flood wiped them out? Or did the earth itself have an age and a history far longer than Scripture seemed to allow? Each possibility was troubling. If extinction was real, then creation was not fixed and perfect. If new creatures had arisen, then perhaps the earth was still changing. And if the earth was changing, then human beings were not the timeless centerpiece they liked to believe themselves to be. And here's where the scholarly debates got even stranger. Some insisted that plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs were antediluvian creatures, survivors from before Noah's flood, destroyed in God's cleansing of the world. Others suggested they were merely odd varieties of crocodile. Still others, bolder, argued that they were evidence of worlds so ancient, so alien, that human history was a mere flicker at the end of an unimaginably long fuse. Meanwhile, Mary herself didn't spend her nights writing treatises or arguing in lecture halls. She spent them cleaning the bones, arranging them carefully, preparing them for sale to collectors who had the means to send them into scholarly circles. It's almost cruel to imagine. She, the finder, working by lamplight in her cottage, scraping mud from ribs with patient fingers, while far away men debated whether she was clever, lucky, or deceitful. But Mary didn't need their approval to know the truth. She had seen the skeleton herself, had coaxed its neck from the stone, had stared into the hollow sockets of its skull. She knew what it was because she had touched it, bone by bone. And you, standing in imagination by her side, might feel the same. Imagine looking at the plesiosaur's neck stretching across the cottage floor, vertebra after vertebra laid in sequence, like a necklace strung from stone. You lean down, brush away dust, and feel the ancient grooves under your fingertips. It's not a trick, it's not a fake, it's real. And suddenly the cliffs don't seem like cliffs anymore, they feel like doorways to another world. Lyme Regis, once just a windswept fishing town, had become the stage for questions too large to answer. Were these fossils proof of a violent, destructive god? Proof of an Earth far older than anyone imagined? Proof that life itself was stranger than human minds could comprehend? Historians still argue which of these interpretations dominated in Mary's day. But one thing is certain. With every strange fossil she pulled from the cliffs, Mary Anning forced people to look deeper into the abyss of time. Step inside Mary's world for a moment, not the windy cliffs this time, but the small, weathered cottage on Broad Street in Lyme Regis, where the air smelled of brine, damp stone, and whatever stew was stretching over the hearth. This was the Anning Fossil Shop, though calling it a shop might conjure something far grander than reality. It was more like a front parlor transformed into a cabinet of wonders, every shelf crowded with relics pulled from the cliffs. Imagine yourself pushing open the creaking door. The light is dim, filtered through small-paned windows streaked with sea spray. On one wall, ammonites are arranged like spirals of eternity, each one catching what little sun manages to break through the clouds. Belemnites stand upright like miniature obelisks, sharp as darts, their glossy black surfaces polished to a sheen. And in the corner, if you're lucky, if it's available, a larger skeleton sprawls in sections, vertebrae stacked neatly, skull balanced like a relic from some nightmare fish. Mary, practical as ever, would be there to greet you, her dress plain, hands perhaps still smudged with shale dust, her voice low but steady. She wasn't the type to gush or flatter. Instead, she let the fossils speak for themselves, guiding your eye with a gesture, explaining what this spiral meant, or where that bone was pulled from the cliffs. If you asked too many foolish questions, she might arch an eyebrow, amused but too polite to mock you outright. Visitors came in waves. A London collector might stride in, pockets jingling, eager to snatch up the rarest specimens for his cabinet. A seaside tourist might linger, fingering a small ammonite, debating whether the souvenir was worth the price of a meal. Sometimes children came, their noses pressed to the glass, marveling at the monsters that seemed to grin back at them from stone. For Mary, this little shop was survival. Each fossil sold meant another week of bread, another chance to pay off debts. And yet, the shop was also something more. It was her stage, her museum, her argument against the world's dismissal of her skill. She couldn't join the Geological Society in London. They didn't admit women. And they certainly didn't admit women of her class. But here, in her shop, she was the authority. Here, as a quirky detail, the Annings would sometimes carve snake heads onto the ends of ammonites before selling them, leaning into the old legend of snake stones. To tourists, it made the fossils seem magical, relics of saints' miracles. To Mary, it was probably just good business, though you can imagine her smirking at the absurdity of dressing up a creature millions of years old just to make it more appealing. The shop also became a meeting place of sorts. Scholars visited, some respectful, some patronizing. Mary listened, nodded, absorbed everything. Though she never published papers, she remembered details with uncanny precision. She could recall which stratum a fossil had come from, how deep it had been buried, what storms had preceded its discovery. More than one learned man realized, sometimes too late, that Mary's casual remarks contained more scientific insight than their entire notebooks, and yet she rarely received formal credit. Fossils sold through her shop traveled far and wide, ending up in museums, universities, and private collections. Papers were written about them, theories debated, names given names that did not include hers. Historians still argue whether this was simple neglect or a deliberate refusal to acknowledge a poor woman's contribution. Either way, Mary's discoveries echoed through scientific halls under other people's voices. Imagine, though, the shop late in the evening, after the day's visitors had gone. Mary kneels by a lantern, cleaning a fossil with quiet focus. The room is dim, the only sound the scratch of her tools against stone, the soft sigh of the sea beyond the window. Around her, the fossils gleam faintly in the light, like an audience of silent witnesses. She works not just for money, not just for survival, but because she cannot stop. The cliffs call her, and the fossils demand to be freed. This shop, humble though it was, became a hub of knowledge and curiosity. Children in town grew up peeking inside, whispering that Mary Anning had monsters in her house. Visitors carried her finds to London, Paris, even America, spreading her influence far beyond the little parlor. And you, standing in the doorway, would sense that this was no ordinary cottage. It was a place where the deep past met the present, where bones older than imagination were cradled in a working woman's hands. It was, in its way, a museum before museums knew what to do with such things, and its quiet curator, Mary, was building a legacy, one sail, one skeleton, one ammonite at a time. The fossil shop kept Mary and her family afloat, but it also placed her at the center of a delicate dance with scholars and collectors, a dance full of admiration on the surface and betrayal simmering beneath. To walk with her through this chapter of life is to feel the tug of recognition on one hand and the sting of exclusion on the other. Picture the scene. A gentleman from London arrives at the cottage, all polished boots and self-impetus. He admires the ichthyosaur skull displayed on the table, strokes his chin, and asks, "And you say you found this, Miss Anning?" Mary.com, but firm, nods. She explains where in the cliff it lay, how long it took to extract, how many storms she endured before the bones were freed. The gentleman smiles, praises her diligence, then buys the fossil. Later, in a learned hall in London, he will present the skeleton as if it were his discovery, perhaps mentioning her name only in passing, if at all. This was the pattern of Mary's relationships with many scientists. They needed her. Without her sharp eyes, her patience, her willingness to risk her life under the cliffs, their collections would have been far poorer. And yet, when it came to formal recognition, she was invisible. Historians still argue whether her exclusion was more about her gender or her class. Likely it was both. In early 19th century Britain, science was a gentleman's pursuit, carried out in lecture halls and societies where a working-class woman had no seat. Still, not every relationship was one-sided. There were genuine friendships, sometimes unlikely ones. Henry de la Becque, the geologist who had known Mary since childhood, remained one of her staunchest supporters. His lithograph, Duria Antiquia, wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was also an act of solidarity. The proceeds from its sale went directly to Mary, helping her weather one of her many financial storms. Imagine her unrolling one of those prints, the fantastical sea creatures swirling across the page, knowing that her finds had inspired not only science but art. There were others too. William Buckland, the eccentric geologist priest, who once kept hyena skulls in his dining room, corresponded with Mary and visited Lyme Regis to see her finds firsthand. He was one of the few to publicly credit her work, though even he sometimes fell into the trap of framing her as a remarkable woman rather than a peer. Then there was the tension with more opportunistic figures. Some men, eager to secure their reputations, swooped in to purchase her most spectacular finds, then rushed to publish descriptions under their own names. You can imagine Mary reading one of these papers. She even managed to obtain a copy, her jaw tightening as she recognized her fossil on the page. Stripped of her story, she rarely complained openly. It wasn't in her nature to pick public fights, but the bitterness must have lingered. Here's a quirky tidbit. One scholar, Charles Koenig of the British Museum, was so enamored of Mary's finds that he reportedly sent assistants to Lyme Regis to hover near her shop, ready to scoop up whatever she unearthed. It's almost like academic paparazzi, lurking in a seaside town, not for scandal, but for fossils. Despite all this, Mary built a reputation that couldn't be entirely denied. Her knowledge of anatomy grew sharper with each discovery. Visitors were stunned at how she could identify bones at a glance, often more accurately than men with formal training. She began sketching fossils in notebooks, recording details with a precision that rivaled scientific illustrations of the time. And though she never published under her own name, her observations filtered into the writings of others, shaping paleontology in ways the wider world might never fully admit. It was a bittersweet balance. On one hand, she was indispensable. On the other, she was undervalued. Friends lifted her up, opportunists pushed her down, and Mary kept walking that narrow ridge. Just as she walked the cliff sure-footed, cautious, and always looking for the next fossil. And you, following in her shadow, might feel both admiration and frustration. Admiration for her grit, her brilliance, her quiet perseverance. Frustration at the unfairness of a world where a woman who unearthed sea dragons could be brushed aside by men who never risked more than ink on their fingers. Yet Mary never let betrayal stop her. She returned to the cliffs, hammer in hand, eyes scanning the shale, as if the fossils themselves were her truest companions, reliable, silent, and full of secrets waiting for her alone. By the time the plesiosaur came into the light, Mary was already known along the coast and in the circles of collectors. But this skeleton, this long-necked, otherworldly creature, was something else entirely. It wasn't just another fossil for the cabinet. It was a spectacle, a provocation, a direct challenge to the imagination, and its arrival turned Mary's quiet work into a storm of attention, argument, and awe. Imagine the day she and her helpers freed the last pieces from the cliff. The neck stretched impossibly far, each vertebra like a bead on a stone necklace. The body was broad, with paddles instead of limbs, as if it had been designed to glide silently through water. The skull was small, absurdly small compared to the rest of it, with teeth sharp as needles. Even to the untrained eye, it looked strange, almost comical. To Mary, it was simply undeniable. Here was another creature the world had never seen alive. When news of the plesiosaur reached London, chaos followed. Georges Cuvier, the famed French naturalist known as the father of paleontology, flatly refused to believe it. He was convinced it was a hoax, bones stitched together from different animals to create a fraud. After all, what kind of beast had a neck longer than its body? It seemed absurd. Historians still argue whether Cuvier's skepticism was honest scientific caution or the product of ego. Unwilling to accept that a poor Englishwoman might overturn his ideas, but Mary's plesiosaur was no hoax. Other scientists examined it, and piece by piece, they confirmed its authenticity. Cuvier himself was forced to admit, somewhat grudgingly, that the skeleton was genuine. The plesiosaur entered the annals of science as one of the most extraordinary fossils ever discovered, and it had been brought to light by a woman who couldn't even vote, let alone lecture at the Geological Society. Here's a quirky tidbit. Caricaturists in London mocked the plesiosaur's appearance, sketching it with a swan's neck and a turtle's body, or joking that it could tie itself in knots. Even today, the plesiosaur sometimes pops up in cryptid lore, with people claiming that the Loch Ness Monster must be one of Mary's long-necked creatures that somehow survived. It's a funny leap, imagining an ancient marine reptile hiding in a Scottish lockbutt. It shows how her discovery slipped from science into folklore. Back in Lyme Regis, Mary kept working, unfazed by the storm of debate. She prepared the plesiosaur skeleton with her usual care, arranging each vertebra in order, cleaning the skull until the sharp teeth gleamed. She must have known, deep down, that this discovery would not just pay the bills, but also etch her name into something larger than her lifetime. And yet, the recognition was still uneven. While scholars marveled at the plesiosaur, Mary was often mentioned as merely the local woman who found it, her brilliance reduced to chance. Men published papers describing her fossil, attaching their own reputations to it, while Mary's own name remained in the background. You can almost feel the frustration in her silence. She had done the work, risked the cliffs, endured the storms, and yet, in the polished halls of science, she was still invisible. Imagine yourself standing in her shop during those years, the plesiosaur bones spread across the floor like an unfinished puzzle. Visitors lean in, whispering, astonished. Some recoil, muttering about monsters and floods. Others stare in wonder, caught between disbelief and fascination. And Mary.com, reserved, points to the details, the shape of the paddles, the joints of the necas, if explaining the obvious to those who had never seen such truths before. The plesiosaur didn't just rattle scientists. It rattled the worldview of the early 19th century. If such a creature had existed, what else had the Earth hidden? How many ages of life had come and gone before humans walked the land? Historians still argue whether Mary herself thought in these grand philosophical terms. Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she was too focused on the practical task of survival. Either way, her discovery forced others to ask questions they could no longer avoid. And for you, watching this unfold, the irony is sharp. A girl from a poor family, with no degree, no connections, no seat in any society, had just given the scientific world one of its greatest revelations. The cliffs whispered their secrets, and Mary, once again, was the one who listened. The plesiosaur might have cemented Mary's place in scientific history, but it also placed her squarely in the middle of a cultural storm. Fossils were no longer just pretty curios for mantelpieces or amusing tokens for seaside tourists. They had become ammunition in one of the fiercest debates of the 19th century. The battle between traditional religious beliefs and the unsettling revelations of geology. Picture yourself sitting in Mary's small shop, the plesiosaur bones stretched out in neat order across the floor, while a group of visitors argue right over them. One insists these are proof of Noah's flood. The remnants of creatures drowned when the waters rose and covered the earth. Another shakes his head, saying the layers of rock show too much order. Too much time. These fossils belong to ages long before humanity ever existed. A third leans in, muttering that such talk borders on blasphemy, and that God would never allow his creation to vanish into extinction. This was the intellectual battlefield Mary inhabited, and she, a working-class woman with dirt under her fingernails, was at the very center of it, not because she sought debate, but because her fossils demanded it. Every ichthyosaur, every plesiosaur, every spiral ammonite was a silent challenge to scripture read literally. If the earth was just a few thousand years old, how could so many vanished creatures be buried layer after layer, deeper and deeper into time? Historians still argue whether Mary herself struggled with these questions. Raised in a devout dissenter household, she grew up steeped in biblical teaching. And yet, the cliffs were telling her a different story, one of deep time, of change, of death, and rebirth, written into stone. Did she reconcile the two, telling herself that the fossils were simply part of God's vast creation? Or did she quietly, privately, doubt what the pulpit proclaimed on Sunday mornings. The truth is, we can't know. Mary left few writings, and what remains suggests a woman of faith who carried her own quiet interpretations. But the debates raged louder among others. In London lecture halls, men like William Buckland, part scientist, part clergyman, tried to balance geology with Genesis. Buckland even argued that the great fossil beds were evidence of the biblical flood, the final cataclysm that reshaped the earth. Others, like Charles Lyell, began to push for a different vision. An earth shaped not by one great disaster, but by slow, steady processes across unimaginable time. Mary's fossils sat at the heart of these arguments. Pulled from the cliffs by her hands, carried to the city, and then transformed into fuel for controversies she did not ignite but could not escape. And here's a quirky tidbit that reveals just how unsettled people were. Some Victorians kept fossils in their parlours not only as conversation pieces, but also as moral warnings. An ammonite on the mantel could be ascribed to guests as a reminder of the flood, proof of divine judgment on sinful humanity. Imagine sipping tea under the stern gaze of a fossilized sea creature, your host explaining that it symbolized God's wrath. Mary herself was far more practical. She knew fossils sold, and she knew fossils revealed truth. While others argued theology, she was out on the cliffs, hammer in hand, rescuing another skeleton before the sea could swallow it. Still, you have to imagine the quiet weight she carried hearing customers in her shop argue about God and time, watching scientists bicker in journals over the meaning of her finds, and knowing that, for all their voices, the real authority was lying in pieces of stone right in front of them. And yet, Mary rarely took sides publicly. She wasn't a preacher, nor was she a pamphleteer. She was a fossil hunter. Her faith may have been complicated, but her actions were simple. She kept searching, kept uncovering, kept trusting the evidence of the cliffs. She didn't claim to have all the answers. She let the stones speak for themselves. For you, listening now, it's almost comforting to imagine her steady presence amid the noise. While others wrung their hands over extinction and divine order, Mary crouched by the cliffside, tapping gently at stone, her face calm, her focus absolute. Perhaps that was her greatest contribution, not only the fossils she found, but the reminder that truth, however troubling, is worth uncovering. By the 1830s, Mary Anning's name was known well beyond Dorset. Collectors boasted of owning her fossils. Scientists based entire careers on the skeletons she had unearthed. And yet, Mary herself remained outside the halls of recognition, watching as her discoveries took center stage while she lingered in the wings. It was a strange, bittersweet kind of fame. Indispensable and undeniable, yet always incomplete. Imagine the paradox. In Lyme Regis, she was a local figure, the woman trudging out in storms with a basket, skirts splattered with mud, her hammer tapping against cliffs. In London, she was a near legend, spoken of with awe and condescension in equal measure. Naturalists mentioned her in letters. That remarkable Miss Anning yet rarely invited her to join their societies or speak at their meetings. She had given them ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, even fragments of flying reptiles, and still the Geological Society of London did not allow her to set foot in its sessions. Women, by rule, were excluded. Historians still argue whether Mary felt bitterness at this exclusion. Some letters suggest she accepted it with weary pragmatism, while others hint at quiet frustration. She once remarked to a friend, "The world has used me so unkindly. I fear it has made me suspicious of everyone." That one line tells you everything. Gratitude mixed with hurt, recognition tinged with betrayal. But she wasn't entirely without allies. Henry de la Becque, her childhood friend turned geologist, remained supportive. William Buckland, eccentric as ever, praised her finds in lectures. Even Charles Lyell, the cautious geologist who argued for deep time, respected her expertise. Still, respect did not equal equality. Papers were published with her fossils front and center, but her name often absent from the title page. And yet, despite these slights, Mary commanded an unusual form of authority. Scholars who visited Lyme Regis quickly realized she knew the cliffs better than anyone alive. She could identify strata by sight, pinpoint the likely places where fossils would emerge, and explain with sharp clarity how a skeleton had been preserved. More than one visitor admitted, grudgingly, that she had taught them more in an afternoon than they had learned in months of reading. Here's a quirky detail. When the King of Saxony visited Lyme Regis in 1844, he made a point of meeting Mary. Imagine that royalty stepping into her little shop, peering at her fossils, perhaps awkwardly trying to make conversation while Mary quietly explained which bones belonged to which monster. Even kings wanted to bask in the glow of her discoveries. Still, fame did not translate into wealth. Mary lived most of her life on the edge of financial ruin. Fossils sold for decent sums, but competition grew as other hunters moved into the trade. And because she lacked the privilege of patrons or inherited money, she was always hustling, always one storm away from disaster. There's a cruel irony in imagining professors in London delivering lectures on her specimens, while Mary herself fretted over rent back in Lyme Regis. Recognition did arrive, but unevenly, like a tide that refused to come all the way in. The British Association for the Advancement of Science granted her a small annuity late in her life, acknowledging her contributions in a backhanded sort of way. Local admirers took up collections to support her when she was ill. Yet she never enjoyed the formal accolades given to men who had discovered far less. Imagine yourself standing in her shop during those years. The fossils are still magnificent. The plesiosaur neck stretched across the table, the ichthyosaur skull glinting in the corner. Visitors marvel, scholars scribbled notes, but Mary's eyes tell a different story. There is pride, yes, but also weariness. She knows how much she has given the world, and she knows how little of that world has given back. And you, watching her, would feel the sharp injustice of it. How can someone who uncovered whole lost worlds remain half forgotten in her own lifetime? How can the cliffs speak so loudly through her hands, and yet the halls of science remain so quiet about her name? Still, Mary carried on. Recognition or not, applause or silence, she kept returning to the cliffs. For her, the fossils themselves were reason enough. By the early 1840s, the years of storms, cliff falls, and endless chiseling had taken their toll on Mary. She was no longer the girl bounding along the shale with a hammer in hand, but a woman in her 40s whose body bore the quiet scars of a lifetime's labor. The sharp Dorset wind had carved lines into her face, and the constant damp seemed to have seeped into her very bones. Yet she remained tireless, even as her health began to falter in ways she could not ignore. Picture her walking down to the beach one last time in those years, her stride slower, her breathing heavier, but her eyes still scanning the cliffs with that same restless hunger. She could not pass a fallen slab of shale without stooping to look, her instinct as sharp as ever. Even in pain, curiosity pulled her forward. Illness crept into her life like a shadow. At first it was fatigue, aches she dismissed as the price of hard work. Then came sharper pains, bouts of weakness that left her unable to climb as she once had. Eventually, she was diagnosed, though in the 19th century. Diagnosis often meant little more than naming the inevitable. Mary had breast cancer. Treatment was rudimentary at best, and comfort, not cure, was all that could be offered. For a woman who had battled cliffs and storms, who had survived lightning and poverty, illness must have felt like the most unfair opponent of all. She could not outwit it with sharp eyes. She could not outlast it with patience. It gnawed at her strength day by day, until even walking the short distance to her shop was a struggle. And yet, Lyme Regis did not let her fade into silence. The very town she had put on the map now rallied around her. Friends and admirers raised money to provide her with a modest pension. Henry de la Becque, always loyal, spearheaded efforts to ensure she would not be left destitute. The Geological Society of London, an institution that had never allowed her through its doors, paid tribute to her contributions in its transactions after her death. Historians still argue whether this was genuine admiration or guilty conscience, but either way, it was acknowledgement at last. Here's a quirky tidbit that softens the sadness. Local children adored Mary, not just for her fossils, but for her kindness. She often let them peek into her shop, telling them stories about sea dragons and long-necked swimmers, as if they were fairy tales. Imagine a group of wide-eyed children crowded around the plesiosaur's bones, Mary smiling despite her pain, weaving magic out of science long before museums became family destinations. Her final years were marked by both struggle and quiet dignity. She never stopped believing in the fossils, never stopped cleaning and arranging them when she had the strength. Even as her illness advanced, she worked with small specimens, polishing ammonites, arranging belemnites in neat rows. It was as though she needed to keep touching the past, even as her own future grew shorter. When Mary died in 1847, at the age of 47, Lyme Regis fell into mourning. Shops closed their shutters. Neighbors lined the streets. The woman who had once been dismissed as the fossil girl was now remembered as the very soul of the town. She was buried in St. Michael's Church. Her grave, later adorned with a stained glass window in her honor, depicting not saints or angels, but a woman with hammer in hand, fossils at her feet. Imagine standing at that graveside, the salty wind brushing your face, gulls circling overhead. The cliffs rise in the distance, still shedding their secrets, still whispering to anyone who will listen. And you realize Mary's story is not one of tragedy, but of triumph. Against poverty, against prejudice, against exclusion. She carved a place in history with nothing but her eyes, her hammer, and her unshakable will. She left behind no children, no volumes of published work, but she left behind something rarer. Proof that truth can be uncovered by anyone willing to look closely, no matter their station, no matter their gender. And that legacy, set in stone, cannot erode. By the time Mary Anning's life came to its close in 1847, she had already transformed Lyme Regis into more than just a picturesque coastal town. The cliffs that once seemed to belong only to gulls and storms had become internationally known as gateways into deep time. And that reputation rested almost entirely on her shoulders. Her legacy, though complicated and often undervalued in her own lifetime, began to grow the moment she was gone, as if the world finally realized what it had lost. Imagine the town in mourning, shutters drawn across shop windows, neighbors speaking in hushed voices, fishermen lowering their caps. For a community used to hardship and loss, Mary's death carried a different weight. She wasn't just another local woman. She was the figure who had given Lyme Regis its claim to fame, who had pulled monsters from the cliffs and turned stones into stories that echoed far beyond Dorset. Her funeral at St. Michael's Church drew people from all walks of life, a rare mingling of locals, scholars, and admirers who understood, however belatedly, that they were laying to rest someone extraordinary. Her grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Over time, a stained glass window was installed in the church in her honor, paid for by the Geological Society of London. This was the same society that had barred her from membership, the same society where men once debated her fossils without granting her a seat in the room. Now they honored her with glass that caught the light, showing not saints or angels, but a woman with hammer in hand and fossils at her feet. It was an image both reverent and revolutionary. Mary, as she truly was, a fossil hunter, immortalized in the house of God. And yet, even with such gestures, her reputation remained uneven for decades. For much of the 19th century, Mary was remembered more as a curiosity herself. Plucky fossil girl, with an uncanny knack than as the scientific mind she was. Scholars built careers on her finds. Museums displayed her fossils, but her name was often tucked into footnotes, a whisper behind the roar of male voices. Historians still argue whether this erasure was due more to sexism, class prejudice, or simply the casual theft of credit so common in the age. Slowly, however, her story resurfaced, much like the fossils she once dug out of the cliffs. In the 20th century, writers and scientists began to re-examine her role, recognizing that paleontology itself, the very idea of reconstructing ancient life from stone, owed its foundation to her persistence. School children in Dorset began learning her name. Museums highlighted her work, not just her specimens. And today, she is celebrated as one of the pioneers of science. A woman who worked outside the system, yet changed it forever. Her influence stretches even further into the realm of imagination. Think of the children who once crowded into her shop, wide-eyed as she pointed to the teeth of an ichthyosaur, or traced the outline of a plesiosaur's neck. For them, fossils were fairy tales you could hold in your hand, stories of dragons and sea serpents that turned out to be real. That same spark has lit generations since. Even now, when children press their faces against museum glass to stare at a skeleton of a long-necked swimmer, Mary's spirit lingers in their awe. Here is a quirky detail that proves just how far her shadow stretches. The Wester, she sells seashells by the seashore, is often said to have been inspired by Mary Anning. Imagine that her fossil shop transformed into a nursery rhyme, her life's work echoing in the playful chant of children long after her death. It may not be entirely true, but the association has stuck, a sign of how she seeped into popular memory as both fact and folklore. Her legacy also shapes modern science. Paleontologists today still reference her finds, still marvel at the accuracy of her observations. The ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pterosaurs she uncovered remain cornerstones in the study of prehistoric life. And more than the bones themselves, her story has become a symbol, proof that brilliance can come from anywhere, that the gates of discovery are not closed to those without wealth, status, or formal training. Imagine yourself walking once more along the cliffs of Lyme Regis, the wind sharp, the shale crunching beneath your boots. The sea roars as it always has, restless, eternal. You stoop to examine a stone, just as Mary once did. Perhaps it holds nothing, or perhaps it holds the faint spiral of an ammonite, the echo of a world millions of years gone. In that moment, you feel her presence, not in superstition, but in the simple act of curiosity, the willingness to look closely, to trust your eyes and your hands. Mary Anning's legacy is written in stone, but also in us, in the questions we ask, in the wonder we feel, in the willingness to believe that the earth is larger, older, and stranger than we once thought. She did not set out to change history. She set out to survive, but in doing so, she unearthed worlds, and her own name became part of the bedrock of science. And so, the cliffs of Dorset still whisper her story. Each storm that strips away a layer, each fossil that gleams in the sun, seems to say, Mary was here. She listened, she understood, and she left the truth behind for us to find. Now, as we leave the cliffs behind and let the waves grow distant, it's time to soften the pace. Let your mind drift from the sharp edges of stone to the gentle wash of the tide. Picture the sea smoothing the beach, the foam dissolving into the sand, the gulls settling into silence. The cliffs, so full of noise and danger in daylight, now stand quiet under a soft grey sky, as if they too are ready to rest. Imagine yourself reclining on the shore, not with tools in hand, but with eyes half closed. The fossils are still there, hidden deep in the cliffs, waiting patiently. They have waited millions of years already, and they can wait a little longer. There is no urgency now, just the steady rhythm of the waves, the hum of the wind, the faint scent of salt that lingers in the air. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting each exhale carry away the day's questions. The monsters Mary uncovered, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the strange flying reptiles fade back into shadow. Not frightening, but comforting. Like old stories told by a familiar voice, they are no longer puzzles demanding answers. They are companions, part of the dreamscape you now enter. The cliffs grow softer in your mind's eye, their edges blurring. The sea grows quieter, more distant. Even the gulls no longer cry, they have settled, just as you are settling now. The weight of stone, the rush of discovery, the sharp debates of scholars all fade into a gentle hush, and in that hush, Mary's story rests beside you, calm, unhurried, complete,